In the venerable city of Jerusalem, long before the thunderous echoes of the First Crusade reverberated through its ancient stones, a quiet, profound act of compassion began to unfold. It was here, amidst the bustling markets and the sacred pathways, around the year 1000 CE, that a humble hospice was established by Amalfitan merchants. These dedicated traders, hailing from the maritime republic of Amalfi in southern Italy, recognized the burgeoning need for care among the increasing numbers of Christian pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land. Imagine the weary travelers, some having journeyed for months, even years, across vast, unforgiving landscapes, their bodies often frail from illness or injury, their spirits perhaps flagging from the sheer arduousness of their devotion. This hospice, nestled near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, offered them not only shelter and sustenance, but also a measure of medical attention, a beacon of solace in a foreign land. The early days of this institution were marked by a simple yet profound dedication to charity. It was not yet an order of knights, nor did it possess the military might it would later wield. Instead, it was a community of devout individuals, both men and women, who committed themselves to the service of the poor and the sick. They operated under the patronage of the Benedictine order, specifically the Abbey of Santa Maria Latina, which had been granted permission by the Fatimid Caliph of Egypt to build a church and a monastery in Jerusalem. This initial foundation, known as the Hospital of St. John the Baptist, laid the very roots of what would become one of history's most enduring and influential organizations. The air within its walls would have carried the scent of medicinal herbs, the murmur of prayers, and the soft sighs of those finding respite. One can almost picture the flickering oil lamps casting long shadows as caregivers moved quietly among the beds, their hands gentle, their faces etched with empathy. As the 11th century drew to a close, the political landscape of the Middle East shifted dramatically. The Seljuk Turks, having expanded their dominion, began to impose stricter controls on Christian pilgrims, making their arduous journeys even more perilous. Reports of harassment and violence against pilgrims reached Europe, stirring deep concern and eventually contributing to the fervent calls for the First Crusade. When the Crusader armies finally arrived at the gates of Jerusalem in 1099, after years of brutal campaigning, the Hospice of St. John was already an established, if modest, presence within the city. Its existence, focused on humanitarian aid, stood in stark contrast to the martial fury that was about to engulf the Holy City. Following the capture of Jerusalem by the Crusaders, the hospice, rather than being swept away by the tide of conquest, found itself in a unique position. Its charitable work was recognized and valued by the newly established Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Gerard Tom, a figure often referred to as Blessed Gerard, emerged as the leader of this burgeoning charitable enterprise. He is widely considered the true founder of the Order of St. John. Under his guidance, the hospice expanded its operations, acquiring more land and resources to accommodate the increased flow of pilgrims and the wounded from the ongoing conflicts. Gerard, a man of profound faith and practical administrative skill, began to formalize the structure of the community, distinguishing it from its Benedictine patrons. This marked a crucial step in its evolution from a mere hospice into an independent religious order. The formal recognition of the Order of St. John came in 1113, when Pope Paschal II issued the papal bull Geraudo Institutori et Successoribus Eis, known as Pia Postulation Voluntatis. This pivotal document officially acknowledged the institution as a religious order, granting it autonomy and exempting it from tithes, while placing it directly under the protection of the Holy See. This papal bull was not merely a formality. It provided the nascent order with immense legal and spiritual authority, allowing it to acquire property, recruit members, and operate across different dioceses without local ecclesiastical interference. It was a clear affirmation of their mission of caring for the poor and sick, and it laid the groundwork for their future expansion and influence. Imagine the sense of legitimacy and purpose that must have settled upon Gerard and his brethren after receiving such a powerful endorsement from the highest spiritual authority in Western Christendom. With this newfound status, the Order of St. John began to attract a diverse array of individuals. While its primary mission remained charitable, the turbulent environment of the Latin East soon necessitated a shift. The roads to Jerusalem, despite the Crusader presence, remained dangerous, plagued by banditry and skirmishes with local Muslim forces. Pilgrims, even after reaching the safety of the hospital, often needed protection on their return journeys. It became increasingly clear that simply caring for the sick was not enough. The vulnerable also needed defense. This realization led to the gradual militarization of the order. Initially, this involved hiring mercenaries or relying on Crusader knights for protection. However, over time, the brothers themselves, many of whom were drawn from the European nobility with a background in arms, began to take up swords alongside their nursing duties. This dual role, caring for the sick and defending pilgrims, was a unique characteristic that set the Hospitallers apart from other religious orders. By the mid-12th century, particularly under the leadership of Raymond Dupuy, Gerard's successor, the order had formally adopted a military component. Raymond, often regarded as the first Grand Master, is credited with drafting the order's first rule, which outlined the duties and responsibilities of its members. This rule, approved by Pope Calixtus II, further solidified their distinct identity. The brothers were now divided into different classes: the knights, who were primarily responsible for military duties, the chaplains, who attended to the spiritual needs of the order, and the serving brothers, who performed various administrative and support roles, including direct care for the sick. The transformation was gradual, driven by necessity rather than initial design. The Hospitallers, alongside the Knights Templar, who emerged slightly later, became the two principal military orders in the Holy Land. Unlike the Templars, whose primary focus was military, the Hospitallers never abandoned their original charitable mission. Their hospitals continued to operate, offering medical care that was remarkably advanced for its time. They developed sophisticated systems for patient care, hygiene, and even surgical procedures. Historians still debate the exact extent of their medical knowledge, with some arguing it was rudimentary by modern standards, while others point to evidence of complex treatments and organized medical facilities that surpassed many European counterparts. What is clear, however, is their dedication to providing care regardless of a patient's religion or social standing, a truly revolutionary concept for the era. Their hospitals in Jerusalem, and later in other Crusader strongholds like Acre, became renowned centers of healing. These were not merely places for the dying, they were active medical institutions. Imagine the sounds within these walls: the hushed voices of nurses, the clinking of medical instruments, the soft groans of the infirm, and the reassuring presence of the brothers. They treated not only Christian pilgrims and soldiers, but also local Muslims and Jews, a testament to their unwavering commitment to universal charity. This commitment often put them at odds with the more zealous elements of the Crusader movement, who saw non-Christians solely as enemies. The Hospitallers, however, seemed to embody a more nuanced understanding of their faith, one that prioritized compassion above all else in the context of their medical mission. As the 12th century progressed, the order's military capabilities grew significantly. They constructed and garrisoned formidable castles throughout the Latin East, playing a crucial role in the defense of the Crusader states. These fortresses, such as Crac de Chevalier in Syria, which they acquired in 1142, were marvels of medieval military architecture. Crac de Chevalier, in particular, is an astonishing example of concentric fortification, designed to withstand prolonged sieges. Its massive walls, towering keeps, and intricate defensive layers whispered tales of impregnability, a stark symbol of the Hospitallers' growing military might. The order became a formidable fighting force, their white cross on a red field, a recognizable and often feared emblem on the battlefield. They participated in countless campaigns and battles, often forming the vanguard or rearguard of Crusader armies, renowned for their discipline and ferocity. Despite their martial prowess, the core identity of the Hospitallers remained rooted in their original vocation. The sick and the poor were still their primary concern. Even in the midst of fierce battles, they would establish field hospitals, tending to the wounded on both sides of the conflict when circumstances allowed. This dual nature, the warrior monk dedicated to both healing and fighting, was a constant tension within the order, but it was also its defining characteristic. They were men of God who wielded swords, but their swords were ultimately meant to protect the vulnerable, to ensure the continued flow of pilgrims, and to safeguard the institutions of care they had so painstakingly built. This unique blend of piety, charity, and military discipline allowed them to adapt and survive through centuries of profound political and social upheaval, even after the loss of the Holy Land. Their legacy began not with a clash of steel, but with a gentle hand extended to a weary traveler, a testament to the enduring power of compassion in a world often consumed by conflict. If you're enjoying this, liking and subscribing truly helps and is much appreciated. The dust of the First Crusade had begun to settle, but the landscape it left behind was far from peaceful. Across the Levant, a patchwork of Crusader states emerged: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. These nascent entities, often isolated and vulnerable, found themselves in a constant state of flux, surrounded by powerful and often hostile Muslim neighbors. It was within this crucible of conflict and devotion that the nascent brotherhood of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, which had humbly cared for the sick and poor, began its slow, inevitable transformation. Initially, their role remained steadfastly charitable, a beacon of solace in a land ravaged by war. Pilgrims, often weary and wounded from their arduous journeys, continued to flock to Jerusalem, and the hospital, under the leadership of figures like Blessed Gerard, offered them refuge. Yet, the realities of the Crusader states were harsh. Roads were perilous, banditry was rife, and the very existence of these Latin enclaves was perpetually challenged. The need for protection, not just for the hospital itself, but for the pilgrims it served, became increasingly apparent. It was a gradual shift, almost imperceptible at first, from tending wounds to preventing them. The pivotal moment, or perhaps more accurately, the pivotal period, arrived with the formal recognition of the order by papal bull. In 1113, Pope Paschal II issued the Pi Postulatio Voluntatis, granting the Hospital of St. John official recognition and placing it directly under the protection of the Holy See, independent of local ecclesiastical authority. This was a crucial step, providing the order with a legal and spiritual foundation that would allow it to grow and evolve. It also confirmed their unique status, not merely as a monastic order, but as a distinct entity with a specific mission in the Holy Land. With this papal blessing, the hospital began to acquire property and endowments across Europe, a network of support that would prove vital for its future military endeavors. These donations, often from pious nobles and monarchs, were not simply acts of charity. They were investments in the spiritual and temporal security of the Holy Land. The order, in turn, established preceptories and commanderies in these distant lands, managing their estates and recruiting new members. This vast, interconnected web of resources would become the lifeblood of their operations in the East. The military evolution of the Hospitallers was not a sudden decree, but a pragmatic response to escalating threats. As early as the 1130s, there are records suggesting that the order was involved in the defense of Crusader territories. For instance, King Fulk of Jerusalem, recognizing their growing strength and dedication, entrusted them with the care and defense of the castle of Beth Gibbelin around 1136. This was a significant departure from their purely charitable origins, marking their first explicit military responsibility. They were no longer just healers, they were guardians. The transformation accelerated rapidly after the Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, which, despite its grand ambitions, largely failed to achieve its objectives and highlighted the precariousness of the Crusader states. The need for a dedicated, professional fighting force, one that was not reliant on the often fickle loyalties of European nobility, became undeniable. The Knights Templar, founded earlier and explicitly as a military order, had already demonstrated the effectiveness of such an organization. The Hospitallers, seeing the success of their rival order, began to emulate their structure and purpose, albeit with their enduring charitable mission still at their core. By the mid-12th century, the Hospitallers were actively recruiting knights, men who would take vows not only of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but also of defending the Holy Land and its pilgrims. These Arier monks, clad in their distinctive black habits emblazoned with a white eight-pointed cross, became a formidable presence on the battlefield. They were organized into a hierarchical structure, with the Grand Master at its head, supported by various officers responsible for different aspects of the order's operations, from military command to the administration of their vast estates. One of the lesser-known aspects of their early military development was their pioneering role in siege warfare and fortification. While much attention is often given to their cavalry charges, the Hospitallers understood the strategic importance of strongholds. They became expert castle builders and defenders, adapting existing structures and constructing new, formidable fortresses across the Crusader states. Crac des Chevaliers, one of the most iconic Crusader castles, was extensively rebuilt and expanded by the Hospitallers in the 12th and 13th centuries, transforming it into an almost impregnable bastion. Its concentric design, with multiple layers of defense, moats, and massive walls, showcased their advanced understanding of military architecture. The strategic importance of these castles cannot be overstated. They served as administrative centers, supply depots, and refuges for the local population during times of conflict. They also controlled vital trade routes and pilgrimage paths, allowing the Hospitallers to exert significant influence over the region. Historians still debate the precise extent to which the Hospitallers and Templars influenced each other's military doctrines and architectural innovations. Was it a competitive exchange of ideas, or did one order primarily learn from the other? The truth likely lies in a complex interplay of both. As these two powerful military orders operated in close proximity, often fighting side by side. The Hospitallers' military prowess was put to the test repeatedly throughout the 12th century. They participated in numerous campaigns and battles, often forming the vanguard or rearguard of Crusader armies. Their discipline, training, and unwavering commitment made them highly effective shock troops. For example, they played a crucial role in the Siege of Ascalon in 1153, a significant victory for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Their knights, despite often being outnumbered, were renowned for their ferocity and refusal to retreat, embodying their vow to fight to the death if necessary. Their transformation was not without internal challenges. The original charitable mission, though never entirely abandoned, had to coexist with the demands of military life. The order developed distinct tongues or langues, representing the different linguistic and national groupings of its members, e.g., Provence, Auvergne, France, Italy, Aragon, England, Germany, and later Castile and Portugal. This structure, while fostering a sense of identity, also sometimes led to internal rivalries and political maneuvering, particularly as the order grew in wealth and influence. The Hospitallers also established a sophisticated logistical network to support their military operations. They managed vast landholdings, raised revenue from their European estates, and maintained supply lines to the Holy Land. This logistical mastery was crucial for sustaining their garrisons and funding their campaigns, a testament to their administrative capabilities alongside their martial skills. They were, in essence, an early form of a multinational military corporation, beholden only to the Pope. By the late 12th century, the Hospitallers, alongside the Templars, had become the primary defenders of the Crusader states. Their presence was a constant thorn in the side of Muslim leaders like Saladin, who recognized their formidable strength and unwavering resolve. Saladin himself, after his decisive victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, reportedly ordered the execution of captured Hospitaller and Templar knights, recognizing them as the most dangerous and unyielding of his adversaries. This grim act underscored the respect, however grudging, that their military prowess commanded. The fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187 marked a turning point for the Crusader states and consequently for the Hospitallers. While they lost their spiritual home, their strategic focus shifted to the remaining coastal strongholds, particularly Acre, which became the new capital of the truncated Kingdom of Jerusalem. From Acre, the Hospitallers continued their fight, participating in the Third Crusade and subsequent campaigns. Their castles, like Margat and Crac des Chevaliers, became crucial bastions against the resurgent Muslim powers. The evolution from a humble infirmary to a powerful military order was complete. The Hospitallers had adapted, demonstrating remarkable resilience and strategic acumen. They had forged a unique identity, blending monastic devotion with martial prowess, a brotherhood committed to both healing the sick and wielding the sword. Their white cross, once a symbol of compassion, now also represented a formidable fighting force, a testament to their enduring presence in the tumultuous history of the Crusader states. Perhaps these walls, built with such care and defended with such ferocity, whispered stories of both solace and struggle to the desert winds, echoing the dual nature of the Knights of St. John. The smoke that choked the air above Acre in 1291 was not merely the pyre of a city, but the funeral shroud of an era. With the fall of the last Crusader stronghold in the Levant, the dream of a Latin kingdom in the Holy Land, nurtured for 2 centuries, finally dissolved into dust and despair. For the Knights Hospitaller, who had fought with a ferocity born of desperation on Acre's crumbling walls, the defeat was a profound trauma. They had been among the last to evacuate. Their Grand Master, Jean de Villiers, wounded and carried from the carnage, a testament to their unwavering commitment. The sea, once their highway to Jerusalem, now became their only escape, carrying them away from the shores they had sworn to protect. Their initial refuge was Cyprus, an island already familiar to them, lying just off the coast. Here, in Limassol, the Hospitallers regrouped, their ranks thinned, their treasury depleted. But their spirit, though bruised, unbroken. Yet Cyprus was not a solution, but a temporary haven. It was a Christian kingdom, yes, but one already established, with its own rulers and its own challenges. The Hospitallers, accustomed to their sovereign independence and their unique mission, found themselves guests rather than masters. They needed a new home, a place where they could rebuild their strength, redefine their purpose, and continue their fight against the rising tide of Mamluk and Ottoman power. The very nature of their order, rooted in hospitality and the care of pilgrims, had been irrevocably altered. With no Holy Land to protect, no throngs of pilgrims to shelter, their original mandate seemed to vanish into the eastern horizon. But the knights were nothing if not adaptable. They had always been warriors, and now, more than ever, their martial prowess would define them. The Mediterranean, once a conduit for Crusader armies, was becoming a dangerous frontier, increasingly dominated by Muslim fleets. Piracy was rampant, trade routes were imperiled, and the Christian maritime powers of Europe were struggling to maintain control. It was in this turbulent sea that the Hospitallers saw their new calling. Their gaze turned westward, across the shimmering waters, towards an island that lay strategically positioned between east and west, Rhodes. This island, a jewel in the Dodecanese, was at the time under the nominal control of the Byzantine Empire, though its actual governance was fragmented, with various Genoese and Venetian lords holding sway, often engaging in their own petty feuds. It was a land of ancient ruins, fertile valleys, and natural harbors, an ideal base for a naval power. The idea of acquiring Rhodes was not new. The Hospitallers had considered it before, but the fall of Acre lent the proposition a new urgency. However, seizing an island, even a loosely governed one, was no small feat. It required resources, planning, and the tacit approval of European powers who might view such an acquisition with suspicion or jealousy. Grandmaster Fawkes de Villaret, who succeeded Jean de Villiers, was the driving force behind this ambitious project. He was a man of vision and determination, understanding that the order needed a true sovereign base to survive and thrive. The campaign to conquer Rhodes began in 1306. It was a complex undertaking involving diplomacy, careful alliances, and ultimately military might. The Hospitallers first secured the support of the Genoese pirate Vignolo de Vignoli, who had some claims and interests in the region. Together, they planned the invasion. The initial landings were met with resistance from the local Greek population and the various petty lords. The Hospitallers, though renowned for their fighting skills, faced a protracted siege of the main city of Rhodes, which was well fortified. The exact timeline of the conquest is a point of some scholarly debate, with some historians suggesting a swift takeover, while others argue for a more prolonged struggle lasting several years. What is clear, however, is that by 1310 the island of Rhodes, along with several smaller neighboring islands, was firmly in the hands of the Knights Hospitaller. This was a pivotal moment in the Order's history. They had transformed themselves from a land-based military order, dedicated to the Holy Land, into a sovereign maritime power. Rhodes became their new heart, their new Jerusalem. They immediately set about fortifying the island. transforming the city of Rhodes into an impregnable fortress. The ancient walls were rebuilt and expanded, incorporating the latest in military engineering. Towers rose, moats were dug, and the harbor was secured. Each of the order's tongues or national divisions, Provence, Auvergne, France, Italy, Aragon, England, Germany, and later Castile, was assigned a section of the city's defenses, creating a diverse and formidable garrison. The Hospitallers on Rhodes became known as the Knights of Rhodes. Their primary mission shifted from land warfare to naval defense. They built a formidable fleet of galleys, swift and powerful ships designed for Mediterranean warfare. These ships patrolled the seas, protecting Christian shipping lanes, engaging in naval battles against Ottoman and Mamluk fleets, and launching punitive expeditions against pirate havens. They became the bulwark of Christendom in the eastern Mediterranean, a constant thorn in the side of the burgeoning Ottoman Empire. Life on Rhodes for the Knights was disciplined and purposeful. The Grand Master ruled with absolute authority, though advised by a council of senior knights. The order continued its charitable work, establishing hospitals on the island that cared for the sick and infirm, both Christian and Muslim, a testament to their enduring commitment to their original mission of hospitality. These hospitals were renowned for their advanced medical practices for the time, attracting skilled physicians and surgeons. The Knights of Rhodes were not merely warriors, they were also administrators, diplomats, and builders. They cultivated the island's fertile lands, encouraged trade, and minted their own coinage, further cementing their status as a sovereign entity. Their presence brought stability and prosperity to Rhodes, attracting merchants and artisans from across the Mediterranean. The city became a vibrant hub, a crossroads of cultures and commerce, albeit one under the strict military rule of the Knights. Yet their position was always precarious. The Ottoman Empire, growing ever stronger, viewed the Knights as an unwelcome obstacle to their expansion. The Knights, for their part, saw themselves as the frontline defenders of Christian Europe. This ideological clash inevitably led to conflict. One lesser-known detail from this period is the diplomatic efforts made by the Knights to secure alliances with various European powers. They often sent envoys to the courts of kings and popes, seeking financial aid, military support, and even recruits, though these appeals were often met with lukewarm responses, as European monarchs were frequently preoccupied with their own internal squabbles. The Knights of Rhodes found themselves embroiled in numerous naval skirmishes and sieges throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. They participated in various crusades, though these were often smaller, more localized affairs, a far cry from the grand expeditions of earlier centuries. They defended Cyprus from Mamluk incursions and even launched raids on the coasts of Egypt and Syria, keeping the pressure on their adversaries. The most significant challenge to their dominion on Rhodes came in 1480, when the formidable Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, fresh from his conquest of Constantinople, turned his attention to the island. He dispatched a massive fleet and army, estimated to be around 100,000 men, to besiege Rhodes. The Knights, numbering perhaps only a few hundred fighting knights, supported by local militia and mercenaries, faced overwhelming odds. The siege was brutal and prolonged, lasting for months. The Ottomans launched relentless assaults, employing massive cannons and innovative siege engines. The Knights, under the leadership of Grand Master Pierre d'Aubusson, defended their fortress with extraordinary courage and ingenuity. They repelled wave after wave of attacks, inflicting heavy casualties on the besiegers. One of the key moments of the siege was the successful defense of the English Tower, which was breached but then retaken in fierce hand-to-hand combat. Ultimately, to the astonishment of Europe, the Knights of Rhodes prevailed. The Ottomans, demoralized by their losses and facing logistical challenges, withdrew in defeat. This victory cemented the Knights' reputation as peerless defenders of Christendom and brought them immense prestige. It also bought them a crucial period of respite, allowing them to further strengthen their defenses and consolidate their power. However, the shadow of the Ottoman Empire never truly lifted. The victory of 1480 was a temporary reprieve, not a permanent solution. The balance of power in the Mediterranean was inexorably shifting. The Ottoman Empire continued to expand, its military might growing with each passing decade. The Knights, though brave and skilled, were a relatively small force, increasingly isolated in a sea dominated by their powerful adversary. Their very existence on Rhodes was a constant challenge to Ottoman supremacy, a defiant Christian outpost in the heart of their burgeoning empire. The stage was set for a final, desperate confrontation, one that would force the Knights to once again adapt or perish. The whispers of the wind through the ancient stones of Rhodes seemed to carry the echoes of future battles, a constant reminder of the precarious peace they held. The echoes of Acre, though distant, still resonated in the hearts of the Knights Hospitaller. Their new home on Rhodes, an island jewel in the Aegean, had become a formidable bulwark against the rising tide of Ottoman power. For over 2 centuries, from the early 14th century, this island fortress served as their sovereign domain, a Christian outpost surrounded by an increasingly dominant Islamic empire. They had transformed Rhodes into an impregnable stronghold, its triple walls and deep moats a testament to their engineering prowess and unwavering resolve. From its harbors, their galleys, adorned with the white 8-pointed cross, patrolled the eastern Mediterranean, safeguarding pilgrim routes and engaging in fierce naval skirmishes that often turned the azure waters crimson. They were not merely guardians of the sick and poor anymore. They were a military order, a formidable naval force, and a sovereign state, their grand master holding the authority of a king. Yet the Ottoman Empire, a force of nature sweeping across Anatolia and into Europe, viewed Rhodes as a thorn in its side, a defiant challenge to its burgeoning dominion. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, had already cast his ambitious gaze upon the island. In 1480, a massive Ottoman fleet, carrying an army estimated at 100,000 men, descended upon Rhodes, initiating a siege that would test the very limits of the Hospitaller's endurance. Grand Master Pierre de Busson, a figure of immense courage and strategic brilliance, rallied the island's defenders, a mere few thousand knights and local militia. The air thrummed with the incessant pounding of Ottoman cannons, their thunderous roars shaking the very foundations of the city. Day after day, breaches appeared in the walls, only to be met with desperate hand-to-hand combat, the clash of steel echoing through the narrow streets. Stories abound of the knights' ingenuity, even constructing a countermine beneath the Ottoman siege works, collapsing enemy tunnels with explosive charges. Historians still debate the precise number of Ottoman casualties, but contemporary accounts suggest they were staggering, far outstripping the losses of the defenders. After nearly 3 months of relentless assault, the Ottomans, demoralized and exhausted, finally withdrew, leaving behind a landscape scarred by war and a city miraculously preserved. The victory was hailed across Christendom, a testament to the Hospitaller's unyielding spirit. This respite, however, was but a brief interlude in the grand drama of geopolitical shifts. The Ottoman Empire, under the formidable Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, continued its relentless expansion, reaching its zenith in the early 16th century. Suleiman, a ruler of vast ambition and military genius, saw Rhodes not just as a strategic nuisance, but as a symbolic affront to his imperial power. The Hospitallers, for their part, understood the looming threat. They knew that another, far greater storm was brewing. In 1522, that storm broke. An unprecedented Ottoman armada, estimated to be over 400 ships carrying an army of perhaps 100,000 to 200,000 men, once again descended upon Rhodes. Against them stood Grand Master Philippe Villiers, Dalil Adam, and a mere 7,000 defenders, a mix of knights, mercenaries, and Rhodian citizens. The odds were impossibly stacked. The siege that followed was one of the longest and most brutal in history, lasting for 6 agonizing months. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder and death, the ground trembling with the continuous bombardment from hundreds of Ottoman cannons. The defenders, though vastly outnumbered, fought with a desperate ferocity born of their unwavering faith and their knowledge that surrender meant the end of their order's independence. Each breach in the walls became a killing ground, a maelstrom of steel and blood. Knights, even those gravely wounded, refused to yield, often dying at their posts. The sheer scale of the Ottoman assault was overwhelming. Wave after wave of janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman army, crashed against the Rhodian defenses. There are accounts of the defenders using boiling oil and Greek fire, an ancient incendiary weapon, to repel the attackers, turning the siege ladders into fiery infernos. Despite their heroic resistance, the relentless pressure began to take its toll. Supplies dwindled, and the ranks of the defenders thinned with each passing day. By December, with their fortifications crumbling and their forces decimated, Grand Master Lyle Adam faced an impossible choice. To continue fighting meant the complete annihilation of his order and the massacre of the remaining inhabitants. To surrender meant abandoning their cherished home, the place they had defended for over 2 centuries. After negotiations with Suleiman, who surprisingly offered honorable terms, the Hospitallers made the agonizing decision to evacuate. On New Year's Day, 1523, a somber procession of the surviving knights, their heads bowed but their spirits unbroken, marched out of Rhodes, their banners flying, their crosses gleaming faintly in the pale morning light. They left behind a city scarred but not broken, a testament to their courage, and sailed into an uncertain future. The fall of Rhodes marked a pivotal moment, not just for the Hospitallers, but for the balance of power in the Mediterranean. It cemented Ottoman control over the Aegean and opened new avenues for their westward expansion. For 7 long years, the Knights of St. John, now a homeless order, wandered across Europe, seeking a new sanctuary. They were guests in various Italian cities, their galleys anchored in foreign ports, their future hanging precariously in the balance. Their pleas for a new base, a new home from which to continue their mission, were heard across the Christian world, but suitable strongholds were scarce, and political will often wavered. Finally, in 1530, a solution emerged. Emperor Charles V, a devout Catholic and the most powerful monarch in Europe, offered them the islands of Malta and Gozo, along with the North African port of Tripoli, in perpetual fiefdom. The terms were clear. They were to pay a symbolic annual tribute of a single Maltese falcon, a gesture that would forever link the order to these rocky islands. Malta, a barren, sun-baked archipelago in the central Mediterranean, was a stark contrast to the fertile, green hills of Rhodes. Its strategic location, however, was undeniable, sitting almost equidistant between Sicily and the North African coast, a natural stepping stone between east and west. It was a rugged, windswept place with few natural resources and a challenging landscape. The Knights, accustomed to the grandeur of Rhodes, initially viewed their new home with some trepidation. Yet, with their characteristic resilience and determination, they set about transforming the islands. They built new fortifications, strengthening the existing defenses and constructing impressive bastions that hugged the coastline. They established hospitals, churches, and palaces, slowly molding Malta into a new, formidable stronghold. The Grand Harbor, a natural deep-water port, became their primary naval base, from which their galleys once again sailed, resuming their patrols and engaging in their ongoing struggle against Ottoman corsairs and imperial fleets. The relocation to Malta was not merely a change of address, it was a profound transformation for the order. They were no longer the sovereign rulers of a rich, established island, but rather the guardians of a strategically vital yet harsh outpost. This new reality forged a deeper sense of purpose and a renewed commitment to their original vows. The spirit of the Hospitallers, though tested by loss and displacement, had found a new, resilient expression on the sun-drenched shores of Malta. They were ready for the next chapter, unknowingly preparing for a trial that would define their legacy for centuries to come. The quiet lapping of the waves against the Maltese cliffs seems to whisper of future battles, of a destiny yet to unfold, a silent promise of enduring defiance against the tides of history. The sun, a relentless eye in the Mediterranean sky, beat down upon the island of Malta, baking its limestone cliffs to a shimmering white. It was the mid-16th century, and the Knights of St. John, having found a new home after their exodus from Rhodes, had transformed this barren outpost into a formidable fortress. The Grand Master, Jean de Valette, a man whose stern gaze and weathered face bespoke years of unwavering dedication, understood deeply the precarious position of his order. They were a thorn in the side of the Ottoman Empire, a persistent challenge to its maritime dominance, and a symbol of Christian resistance. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the architect of an empire that stretched from the Balkans to North Africa, harbored a singular ambition: to crush this order once and for all. He saw Malta not merely as an island, but as a strategic stepping stone, a vital link in his grand design to control the Mediterranean and perhaps even to threaten Rome itself. The whispers of an impending invasion had reached Malta long before the Ottoman fleet appeared on the horizon. Spies, merchants, and even the changing patterns of trade routes hinted at the gathering storm. De Valette, with the grim foresight of a seasoned warrior, had spent years preparing. The fortifications, particularly the star-shaped Fort St. Elmo, guarding the entrance to the Grand Harbor, had been strengthened, their walls thickened, and their bastions bristled with cannon. Supplies of food and water were meticulously stockpiled, and the island's meager population, alongside the order's knights and mercenaries, were drilled relentlessly. There was a palpable tension in the air, a quiet resolve mixed with an underlying current of fear. The year 1565 dawned, and with it, the certainty of conflict. On May 18, 1565, the sea, usually a placid blue, seemed to churn with an ominous energy. Over 180 Ottoman ships, a vast armada carrying an estimated 40,000 men, including elite janissaries, formidable cavalry, and a massive siege train, appeared like a dark cloud on the horizon. Against this overwhelming force, de Valette could muster barely 600 knights, 1,200 mercenaries, and a few thousand Maltese irregulars. The disparity was staggering. A David and Goliath struggle played out on a grand scale. The Ottoman commander, Mustafa Pasha, a veteran general, was confident of a swift victory. He believed that Fort St. Elmo, the initial target, would fall within days, opening the harbor for his fleet and allowing him to easily overwhelm the rest of the island. The siege began with a thunderous roar. Ottoman artillery, some of the largest siege guns ever seen, began to pound Fort St. Elmo. The bombardment was relentless, a continuous barrage that shook the very foundations of the earth. The defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a desperate courage that bordered on fanaticism. Wave after wave of Ottoman assaults crashed against the fort's battered walls. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, often in the suffocating dust and smoke, amidst the screams of the wounded and the dying. The knights, clad in their distinctive surcoats, fought alongside their men, their presence a rallying point. One particularly grim detail from the siege was the Ottoman practice of floating the headless bodies of captured or slain knights across the harbor to demoralize the defenders. In response, the knights retaliated by decapitating Ottoman prisoners and firing their heads back into the enemy camps. This gruesome exchange underscored the ferocity and desperation of the conflict. As the days turned into weeks, Fort St. Elmo became a charnel house. The walls crumbled, the defenders dwindled, but their resistance never faltered. De Valette, watching from across the harbor, sent what few reinforcements he could, knowing that the fort's prolonged defense bought precious time for the other fortifications to be strengthened. He understood that St. Elmo was a sacrifice, a bulwark that had to hold for as long as humanly possible, drawing the enemy's strength and delaying their advance. Historians still debate the precise strategic motivations behind Mustafa Pasha's initial focus on Fort St. Elmo. Some argue it was a sound tactical move to secure the harbor, while others contend it was a costly diversion that allowed the knights to consolidate their defenses elsewhere. Regardless, the fort's defenders held out for an astonishing 31 days, far longer than Mustafa Pasha had anticipated. On June 23rd, after weeks of unimaginable suffering, the last remaining defenders of Fort St. Elmo were finally overwhelmed. The Ottoman flag was raised over its ruins, but the victory had come at a terrible cost, estimated to be around 8,000 Ottoman lives, including many of their elite janissaries. With St. Elmo taken, the Ottoman forces turned their attention to the main fortifications, Birgu and Senglia, the two peninsulas that formed the heart of the knights' defenses, now collectively known as the Three Cities. The Grand Master himself took command of the defense of Birgu, while the skilled engineer, Francesco Balbi di Correggio, meticulously documented the siege, providing invaluable insights into the daily struggles. The Ottoman strategy involved simultaneous assaults by land and sea. Their galleys attempted to force their way into the harbors, while massive land armies launched repeated attacks on the bastions. The summer heat was oppressive, exacerbating the suffering of both besiegers and besieged. Disease began to spread through the Ottoman camps, a silent killer that claimed lives alongside the cannon fire. The fighting was relentless, a grinding war of attrition. The knights and their Maltese allies displayed extraordinary ingenuity and resilience. They dug countermines to collapse Ottoman tunnels, launched daring sorties to disrupt enemy preparations, and even devised a primitive form of flamethrower, using a mixture of naphtha and oil to repel attackers. One particularly desperate moment came when a massive Ottoman assault threatened to breach the walls of Senglia. The Grand Master, despite his advanced age, for some reason he unequivocally gave in to the dead, personally led a counterattack, inspiring his men with his unwavering courage. He was a figure of immense moral authority, his presence a constant source of strength in the face of overwhelming odds. Perhaps the very stones of the bastions, scorched by cannon fire and stained with blood, whispered tales of valor to the indifferent stars. As the siege dragged into September, the Ottoman forces, exhausted and demoralized, began to lose heart. Their supplies were dwindling, their ranks thinned by battle and disease, and their morale sapped by the unyielding resistance of the defenders. Mustafa Pasha, increasingly frustrated, launched a final desperate assault on September 7th. It was repelled with heavy losses. Unknown to the Ottomans, a small relief force, the Gran Soccorso, had finally arrived from Sicily. Though only a few thousand men, their appearance on the horizon, heralded by trumpets and banners, sent a wave of panic through the Ottoman ranks. Believing a much larger Christian army had arrived, Mustafa Pasha made the fateful decision to withdraw. On September 8, 1565, after 118 days of continuous fighting, the Ottoman fleet weighed anchor and sailed away, leaving behind a devastated landscape, thousands of dead, and a legend. The Great Siege of Malta was over. The victory was hailed across Christian Europe as a miracle, a testament to faith and courage against seemingly insurmountable odds. The Knights of St. John, though severely depleted, had held the line. Their reputation as the bulwark of Christendom against the Ottoman Empire was cemented forever. The order had paid a heavy price, losing over 250 knights and thousands of their soldiers and Maltese allies. But they had saved Malta and arguably prevented a deeper Ottoman thrust into Western Europe. The aftermath of the siege saw a period of intense rebuilding and consolidation. Grand Master Jean de Valette, now a celebrated hero, embarked on the ambitious project of constructing a new, impregnable capital city named Valletta in his honor. This city, with its grid-like streets and formidable fortifications, was designed to be a fortress in itself, a testament to the order's resilience and a deterrent against future attacks. The order's wealth, bolstered by donations from grateful European monarchs, flowed into Malta, transforming it from a barren rock into a strategic jewel. The knights continued their maritime activities, their galleys patrolling the Mediterranean, engaging in skirmishes with Ottoman and Barbary corsairs, and protecting Christian shipping lanes. However, the zenith of their military power, achieved during the Great Siege, also marked a subtle shift in their purpose. As the Ottoman threat gradually receded and European powers developed their own formidable navies, the knights' role as the primary defenders of Christendom began to diminish. Their focus increasingly turned towards their naval operations, their hospitals, and their philanthropic endeavors. They became a significant naval power in their own right, their galleys renowned for their speed and firepower. Yet, the very success of the Great Siege and the subsequent peace it brought ironically sowed the seeds for a gradual decline in their direct military necessity. The world was changing, and the age of crusading orders, while not entirely over, was slowly giving way to the rise of nation-states and professional standing armies. The Knights of Malta, however, continued to embody their ancient vows, their white eight-pointed cross, a familiar sight on the waves, a silent reminder of their extraordinary past. The grand tapestries of the world were slowly, imperceptibly shifting, their vibrant hues of ancient chivalry beginning to fade into softer, more nuanced shades. The very air that had once hummed with the clatter of steel and the distant thunder of cannon was now increasingly filled with the quiet rustle of turning pages and the murmur of reasoned discourse. As the 18th century dawned, A new intellectual current, subtle yet profound, began to flow across Europe, challenging the very foundations upon which institutions like the Knights Hospitaller had been built. This was the Age of Enlightenment, a period when the light of human reason sought to illuminate every corner of society, questioning inherited authority, championing individual liberty, and advocating for progress through science and philosophy. For centuries, the Order's existence had been inextricably linked to the ebb and flow of conflict. Their martial prowess and charitable works bound together in a singular, divinely sanctioned mission. But now, the nature of warfare itself was undergoing a quiet revolution. The age of sail, which had once seen their galleys dominate the Mediterranean, was slowly giving way to new naval strategies and technologies, making the individual powerful warship less critical than organized national fleets. Piracy, though still a nuisance, was being systematically suppressed by emerging national navies, diminishing the need for the Order's privateering activities. The Ottoman Empire, while still a formidable power, was no longer viewed as the existential threat it once was to Christian Europe, its expansionist fervor having cooled. The great crusading impulse, which had fueled the Order's early centuries, had long since receded into the annals of history, replaced by a complex web of dynastic alliances, economic rivalries, and colonial ambitions among European powers. This shifting geopolitical landscape left the Knights in an increasingly awkward position. Their military relevance, once undeniable, began to wane. They were still a formidable force on paper, their fortifications on Malta impressive, their naval fleet respectable. Yet, the grand powers of Europe, France, Britain, Austria, Russia, were now building professional armies and navies on a scale the Order could never hope to match. Their role as the bulwark against the East, once celebrated, became less of a necessity and more of a historical anachronism. This decline in external purpose inevitably led to internal strife. Without a clear, unifying external enemy, the various langues or national divisions within the Order began to turn their attention inward, their ancient rivalries and national interests resurfacing with renewed intensity. The French language, for instance, often found itself at odds with the Spanish or Italian language, their allegiances frequently shifting with the political currents of their respective homelands. This was a far cry from the early days, when a shared devotion to the Holy Land and the sick transcended national identities. The common treasury, once generously replenished by donations and the spoils of war, now faced increasing pressure. The European monarchs, increasingly absolutist in their rule, began to eye the Order's vast estates and revenues within their own territories with covetous eyes. They questioned why such wealth should flow out of their kingdoms to an independent, supranational entity whose military utility was diminishing. The intellectual currents of the Enlightenment further exacerbated the Order's challenges. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau, while not directly attacking the Hospitallers, critiqued institutions based on inherited privilege, religious dogma, and feudal structures. They championed reason, individual rights, and meritocracy. The very concept of a monastic military order, rooted in medieval piety and aristocratic lineage, seemed increasingly out of step with these progressive ideals. While the Knights themselves were not immune to these new ideas. Many Grand Masters and high-ranking knights were educated men, conversant with the latest philosophical trends. The core identity of the Order was resistant to radical change. How could an institution founded on vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and dedicated to the defense of the faith, fully embrace an era that questioned the very nature of faith and celebrated individual autonomy. One particularly revealing episode of this era was the suppression of the Jesuit order in the mid-18th century. Though distinct from the Hospitallers, the Jesuits were another powerful international religious order that had amassed significant wealth and influence. When various European monarchs, particularly in France, Spain, and Portugal, decided they were a threat to their authority or an impediment to their reforms, they were systematically expelled and their assets seized. This sent a chilling message to all independent religious orders. Even the most powerful could be vulnerable to the whims of absolute monarchs. The Knights Hospitaller, watching these events unfold, must have felt a tremor of unease, realizing their own ancient privileges were not inviolable. Indeed, the order's wealth, derived from centuries of donations and commanderies across Europe, became a double-edged sword. While it provided resources, it also attracted unwanted attention. Many European rulers, facing mounting debts from their own wars and lavish courts, saw the order's properties as a convenient source of revenue. The argument that these lands were held in trust for a fading military purpose became increasingly persuasive to those seeking to consolidate power and wealth within their own national boundaries. The Grand Masters of this period found themselves navigating an increasingly treacherous political landscape. They were no longer dealing with fellow Crusaders or pious monarchs, but with calculating statesmen driven by raison d'etat, the interests of the state. They sought to maintain the order's neutrality in European conflicts, a difficult task when their members hailed from warring nations. They tried to emphasize their charitable works, their hospitals, and their role as a neutral port in the Mediterranean, hoping to prove their continued utility. Yet the perception of their core identity as a military force persisted, even as that force became less relevant. A subtle but significant shift also occurred in the order's recruitment. While noble birth remained a prerequisite, the motivations for joining began to change. Fewer young men arrived driven by fervent religious zeal or the desire for martial glory against the Ottomans. Instead, many saw the order as a prestigious career path, a way to secure a comfortable living, or a means to avoid less desirable fates at home. This is not to say that piety vanished, but the overall ethos became more secular, more akin to a gentleman's club or a naval academy than a monastic brotherhood. Historians still debate the extent to which the order's internal decay contributed to its eventual downfall, versus the overwhelming external pressures of a changing world. Was it a failure of leadership to adapt, or simply an inevitable consequence of an institution whose time had passed? Perhaps it was a combination of both. The very strength of their traditions, which had ensured their survival for centuries, also made them less flexible in the face of radical change. Their deep roots in the medieval world made it difficult for them to flourish in the soil of the Enlightenment. As the 18th century drew to a close, the storm clouds on the horizon gathered, not from the east, but from the west. The French Revolution, erupting in 1789, would unleash forces that would sweep away ancient regimes, aristocratic privileges, and, ultimately, the very existence of the order on Malta. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, while noble in themselves, were antithetical to an institution founded on hierarchical nobility and religious distinction. The revolutionary government in France, viewing the order as an anachronistic feudal remnant and an enemy of the people, quickly moved to confiscate its vast properties within French territories. This was a catastrophic blow, as the French langue had historically been the wealthiest and most influential. Other revolutionary and Napoleonic governments across Europe followed suit, seizing the order's assets in their own domains. The financial lifeline that had sustained the knights for centuries was being systematically severed. The order, once a beacon of military might and charitable devotion, found itself increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Its ancient vows, its venerable traditions, its very identity seemed to whisper stories to the silent stones of Malta, stories that the New World no longer seemed to hear. The stage was set for a dramatic, almost inevitable confrontation, not with a distant enemy, but with the relentless march of history itself. The knights, masters of the sea and guardians of the sick, were about to face a challenge for which their centuries of experience had offered no preparation: the complete erosion of their traditional power and influence, leading to a profound transformation, or perhaps an end. The gentle hum of the Mediterranean, which had for centuries cradled the Knights of St. John, began to carry a new, unsettling frequency in the late 18th century. Far beyond the sun-drenched ramparts of Valletta, a storm was brewing, one that would reshape not only the face of Europe, but also the very destiny of the order. The year 1789 saw the Bastille fall in Paris, an event that sent shockwaves across the continent, challenging the very foundations of monarchy, aristocracy, and established religion. For an institution as deeply rooted in feudal tradition and Catholic faith as the Knights Hospitaller, the French Revolution was not merely a political upheaval, it was an existential threat. The initial tremors were economic. Many of the order's commanderies and estates, the very lifeblood of its financial stability, were located in France. As revolutionary fervor intensified, these properties were seized, deemed assets of the old regime, and nationalized. The flow of vital revenue, which had sustained the order's hospitals, galleys, and fortifications for generations, dwindled to a trickle, then ceased almost entirely. Grand Master Emmanuel de Rohan-Polduc, a shrewd diplomat who had guided the order through relatively peaceful waters for decades, watched with increasing alarm as the financial bedrock beneath Malta began to crumble. He appealed to European powers, but their attention was consumed by the unfolding drama in France, and their sympathies, if any, were often secondary to their own national interests. The ideological current of the revolution also proved corrosive. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, while inspiring to many, were antithetical to the hierarchical, aristocratic structure of the order. The concept of a sovereign, military religious body, drawing its power from ancient vows and papal authority, seemed an anachronism in a world increasingly embracing republicanism and secular governance. Young knights, particularly those from French territories, found themselves torn between their ancient vows and the compelling new ideologies sweeping their homelands. Some quietly, or even openly, abandoned their posts, drawn by the promise of a new order. De Rohan-Polduc passed away in 1797, leaving behind an order facing unprecedented challenges. His successor, Ferdinand von Hompesch zu Bolheim, was elected amidst this climate of profound uncertainty. Hompesch, a German knight, was the first Grand Master not of French origin in over 2 centuries, a subtle shift reflecting the weakening influence of France within the order. He inherited a treasury that was virtually empty, a military force whose morale was flagging, and a political landscape that was becoming increasingly perilous. The Mediterranean, once the order's domain, was now a chessboard for the ambitions of emergent European powers, and among them, one figure stood poised to redraw the map of the world: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, a brilliant and ruthless military strategist, saw Malta not merely as an island, but as a crucial stepping stone in his grand design for conquest. His ambition stretched far beyond Europe, he envisioned a French empire that would extend into the east, challenging British dominance in India. For this audacious plan, control of the Mediterranean was paramount, and Malta, with its formidable fortifications and strategic location, was an indispensable prize. It sat at the crossroads of East and West, a natural naval base, and a gateway to Egypt and beyond. In May 1798, Napoleon embarked on his expedition to Egypt. His fleet, comprising hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers, sailed from Toulon. His true destination was kept a closely guarded secret, even from many of his own generals. As the massive armada sailed eastward, it made a deliberate detour. On June 6, 1798, the French fleet appeared off the coast of Malta, an awe-inspiring and terrifying sight. The sheer scale of the force left no doubt as to Napoleon's intentions. Grand Master Hompesch found himself in an impossible predicament. The Order's traditional allies, the European monarchies, were either embroiled in their own conflicts or had been neutralized by French power. The knights themselves were a shadow of their former selves. Many of the French knights, bound by loyalty to their homeland or swayed by revolutionary ideals, refused to take up arms against their countrymen. The Maltese populace, though generally loyal to the Order, was weary of constant siege preparations and the economic hardship inflicted by the ongoing political turmoil. There was also a subtle undercurrent of resentment among some Maltese towards the foreign elite who ruled them. Napoleon, ever the master of psychological warfare, played on these divisions. He demanded entry to the Grand Harbor, ostensibly for water and provisions, a request that, if granted, would place the French fleet in an unassailable position within the heart of the Order's defenses. Hompesch, knowing that to refuse would mean immediate war and to accept would mean certain subjugation, attempted to negotiate. He offered limited entry for only a few ships at a time, citing the Order's neutrality. Napoleon, of course, rejected this outright. He had not come to negotiate. He had come to conquer. On June 9, 1798, French forces began landing on various points around the island, overwhelming the scattered and demoralized defenders. The resistance was sporadic and largely ineffective. Some individual knights fought bravely, but the Order as a whole lacked the cohesion and resolve that had characterized its earlier struggles. Within hours, the French had established beachheads and were advancing towards Valletta. The fortifications, once deemed impregnable, were designed to withstand a siege from the sea, not a simultaneous land invasion from multiple points by an overwhelming force. The speed and ease of the French conquest astonished many. Historians still debate the precise extent of internal treachery versus sheer military superiority in the fall of Malta. Some accounts suggest that French knights within the Order, perhaps even high-ranking officials, actively conspired with Napoleon, weakening the defenses from within. Others argue that the Order was simply too weakened by financial ruin, internal dissent, and a lack of modern military preparedness to resist such a formidable adversary, regardless of any covert actions. What is clear is that the spirit of the crusading order, the fierce determination that had held back the Ottomans at Rhodes and Malta, had largely dissipated. On June 12, 1798, after only 3 days of token resistance, Grand Master Hompesch signed the capitulation. The terms were humiliating. The order was to surrender Malta and all its dependencies to the French Republic. In return, Hompesch and the knights were allowed to leave the island, taking their personal effects and were promised pensions, which, predictably, never fully materialized. The French immediately set about dismantling the order's institutions. Its vast treasury, what little remained, was plundered, its archives rifled through, and its symbols of power, including the Grand Master's palace and the auberges, were seized. The ancient hospital, a beacon of mercy for centuries, was converted to French military use. The very cross that adorned the order's flag, a symbol of its spiritual mission, was seen by the revolutionaries as a relic of an oppressive past. The fall of Malta was not merely the loss of a territory. It was the loss of the order's sovereign home. Its physical and spiritual anchor for 268 years. The knights, once masters of an island fortress, were now exiles, dispersed across Europe. The Grand Master and his retinue initially sought refuge in Trieste, then in St. Petersburg, Russia. Tsar Paul I, a staunch admirer of chivalry and a fervent anti-revolutionary, offered patronage and even assumed the title of protector of the order, much to the consternation of the Catholic Church and many traditionalist knights. This period saw a fascinating, albeit brief, Russian interlude in the order's history, with some even suggesting a potential move of the order's headquarters to Russia, a notion that ultimately proved untenable due to religious differences and geopolitical realities. The dispersal of the knights was profound. Without a sovereign territory, without a unified command, and without a common purpose beyond their vows, they scattered. Some returned to their homelands, seeking to rebuild their lives in a world that no longer recognized their ancient privileges. Others continued to serve in various armies across Europe, their military skills still valuable, though their identity as Hospitallers was now largely ceremonial. The order's once mighty fleet, its galleys and ships, were either seized by the French or decayed in port, their sails no longer catching the Mediterranean wind in pursuit of corsairs or in defense of Christendom. The period immediately following the loss of Malta was one of profound uncertainty and reorganization. The very existence of the order was in question. Without a territorial base, how could it maintain its sovereignty? Without a unified military, how could it fulfill its ancient role as a defender of the faith? Without its traditional sources of income, how could it sustain its charitable works? The loss of Malta forced a fundamental reevaluation of the order's identity and mission. It could no longer be a military power in the traditional sense. The age of chivalric warfare was effectively over, swept away by the cannons of Napoleon and the new doctrines of national armies. Yet amidst the ashes of its former glory, a quiet, resilient spirit endured. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and the commitment to serving the sick and the poor remained. This core mission, often overshadowed by the order's military prowess in centuries past, now came to the forefront. The knights, though dispersed, maintained communication, often through clandestine networks. They held chapters, albeit in exile, and continued to elect Grand Masters, even if these leaders lacked a physical domain to govern. The subsequent decades were marked by a series of attempts to regain a sovereign territory, or at least to find a new, permanent home. The Congress of Vienna in 1815, which redrew the map of Europe after Napoleon's defeat, offered a glimmer of hope. The order lobbied intensely for the return of Malta, but the island had fallen into British hands in 1800 after a Maltese uprising against the French occupation, supported by the British. Britain, recognizing Malta's strategic value, had no intention of relinquishing it. The pleas of the order fell on deaf ears, overshadowed by the larger geopolitical concerns of the great powers. Without a territorial base, The order effectively became an extraterritorial entity, its sovereignty recognized not by land, but by international law and its ancient lineage. It moved its headquarters from place to place: Messina, Catania, Ferrara, and eventually, in 1834, to Rome. This move to the Eternal City marked a pivotal moment. It signaled a definitive shift away from its military past and a renewed focus on its humanitarian mission. The Order of St. John, once a formidable military force, was now transforming into a purely humanitarian organization, albeit one with a unique sovereign status. The loss of Malta, therefore, was not the end of the order, but rather a forced metamorphosis. The cannons of Napoleon had shattered its old form, but in doing so, they inadvertently cleared the way for a new purpose. The once mighty warriors, who had stood guard over the sacred sites and battled corsairs on the high seas, now faced a different kind of challenge: to adapt, to survive, and to redefine their mission in a rapidly changing world. The whispers of the Mediterranean, which had once carried the shouts of battle and the clang of steel, now began to carry the quiet murmurs of healing and charity, a testament to an enduring spirit that refused to be extinguished. The grand, fortified walls of Valletta, once the heart of a sovereign state, now stood as a silent monument to a bygone era, while the order itself, stripped of its temporal power, began to forge a new path, one dedicated to the very essence of its original calling: caring for the sick and the poor. Wherever they might be, the sun, once a fiery symbol emblazoned on their banners, now seemed to cast a softer, more reflective light upon the remnants of the order. Stripped of their island fortress, their fleets, and their vast territorial holdings, the Knights of St. John found themselves adrift, not just physically, but existentially. The year 1798 had marked an undeniable end to an era, a violent severing from centuries of military might and sovereign rule. Yet, even in this profound dislocation, the ancient spirit of the Hospitallers, born not of conquest, but of compassion, began to stir once more. Their immediate future was one of profound uncertainty. Dispersed across Europe, many knights sought refuge in their home countries, their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience now tested by a world that no longer recognized their temporal authority. The Grand Master, Ferdinand von Hompesch zu Bolheim, whose brief and ill-fated leadership had overseen the loss of Malta, eventually abdicated in 1799. His resignation opened a period of intense internal debate and external politicking, as various European powers, particularly Russia, sought to influence the order's future. It was during this tumultuous time that Tsar Paul I of Russia, deeply sympathetic to the order's plight, and perhaps seeing an opportunity to extend Russian influence, offered refuge to a significant number of displaced knights. He even went so far as to declare himself Grand Master, a move that, while never fully recognized by the Holy See or all branches of the order, undeniably provided a temporary anchor for many. This period, from the loss of Malta to the early 19th century, was a true crucible, forcing the order to confront its very essence. Was it a military entity, forever bound to the defense of Christendom? Or was its true calling the humble service to the sick and the poor, a mission that predated even the First Crusade? The answer, slowly and painstakingly, began to emerge from the ashes of their former glory. The Napoleonic Wars, which had swept them from Malta, continued to reshape Europe, and the order, without a fixed home or military purpose, found itself increasingly irrelevant in the grand geopolitical schemes of the time. However, this very irrelevance became a strange kind of liberation, with no territory to defend, no navies to maintain, and no armies to command, the Hospitallers were forced to look inward, back to their foundational charism. The idea of re-establishing themselves as a purely charitable and humanitarian organization, an echo of their earliest days in Jerusalem, gained traction. By the early 19th century, the order's scattered remnants began to coalesce. Rome, the Eternal City, became their de facto spiritual and administrative center. In 1805, the lieutenant of the Grand Magistry, Giovanni Battista Tomasi, was elected, marking a crucial step towards re-establishing a unified leadership, albeit one without sovereign territory. This period saw the order grappling with its identity, its very survival hanging in the balance. Historians still debate the precise moment or decision that definitively steered the order away from its military past and firmly towards its humanitarian future. Was it a conscious, collective decision, or a gradual, organic shift driven by necessity and changing geopolitical realities? Perhaps it was a blend of both, a quiet realization dawning upon the scattered knights that their true strength lay not in the sword, but in the healing touch. The re-establishment was not without its challenges. Finances were perpetually strained, and the Grand Magistry, now operating from modest premises in Rome, had to painstakingly rebuild its administrative structures. Yet, the core mission, though dormant for centuries under the weight of military priorities, began to reassert itself. Small, localized initiatives started to emerge, often driven by individual knights or local associations. In France, for example, the order began to support hospitals and dispensaries, quietly resuming their ancient role as caregivers. In Italy, similar efforts took root, focusing on providing aid to the sick and the destitute. These were not grand, state-sponsored endeavors, but rather humble, often unnoticed acts of charity, reminiscent of Brother Gerard's original infirmary. The formal pivot towards humanitarianism gained significant momentum in the mid-19th century. The election of Fra Carlo Candida in 1845 as lieutenant of the Grand Magistry, followed by the restoration of the Grand Magistry itself with the election of Fra Giovanni Battista Ceschi a Santa Croce in 1879, provided the necessary leadership and stability. It was under Ceschi a Santa Croce that the order truly began to redefine itself for the modern age. The focus shifted entirely to medical, social, and charitable works. The military titles and trappings remained, largely as historical vestiges, but the practical activities of the knights were now almost exclusively dedicated to alleviating suffering. One of the lesser-known but significant aspects of this re-establishment was the order's involvement in the burgeoning field of international humanitarian law. While not a direct participant in the drafting of the First Geneva Convention in 1864, the order's long history of caring for the wounded on battlefields, regardless of allegiance, resonated deeply with the principles being articulated by figures like Henry Dunant. The order, through its various national associations, began to actively participate in relief efforts during conflicts, often working alongside or in parallel with the newly formed Red Cross societies. This was a natural evolution, as the Hospitallers had, in a sense, been practicing a form of neutrality in medical care for centuries, treating friend and foe alike in their infirmaries. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the order expand its humanitarian activities dramatically. They established hospitals, dispensaries, and ambulance services across Europe and beyond. During the First World War, despite lacking a sovereign territory, the order's national associations mobilized extensively, providing medical aid on an unprecedented scale. They ran hospitals, organized ambulance corps, and cared for wounded soldiers and civilians. This period truly cemented their new identity. The image of the knight, once clad in armor and bearing a sword, was now increasingly associated with the white coat of a doctor or the compassionate hand of a nurse. The order's unique status, having once been a sovereign entity, also allowed it to operate with a degree of diplomatic independence, even without a territory. This was formally recognized in 1920 when the order was granted permanent observer status at the League of Nations and later at the United Nations. This diplomatic recognition, though symbolic, underscored its unique role as a non-state actor dedicated to humanitarian service. It allowed the order to advocate for the vulnerable on an international stage, leveraging its historical gravitas for modern purposes. The transformation was profound. From a formidable military power that once controlled vast swathes of the Mediterranean, the order had reinvented itself as a global humanitarian organization. Their focus became singular: to care for the sick, the poor, and the suffering, echoing the original mission of Brother Gerard and his humble infirmary in Jerusalem. They established medical missions in developing countries, ran hospitals and elderly care homes, and provided disaster relief worldwide. The eight-pointed cross, once a symbol of military prowess, now signified hope, healing, and compassion. Perhaps these humble acts, performed without fanfare or territorial ambition, were the truest embodiment of their ancient vows, a quiet testament to resilience and an enduring commitment to humanity. The whispers of their past battles faded, replaced by the quiet rustle of hospital linens and the gentle murmur of prayers for the ailing. The dawn of the 20th century found the Order of Malta, once a formidable military power and then a sovereign state, navigating a world utterly transformed. The old empires were crumbling, new ideologies were rising, and the very concept of warfare was undergoing a terrifying metamorphosis. Yet, amidst this upheaval, the order, stripped of its territorial possessions for over a century, began to redefine its purpose with a renewed vigor, focusing entirely on its ancient charism of care for the sick and the poor. It was a remarkable pivot, from the clatter of swords to the quiet hum of hospital wards, from the defense of fortresses to the delicate touch of compassion. The first global cataclysm, the Great War of 1914 to 1918, thrust the order back into large-scale humanitarian action, albeit in a capacity far removed from its crusading past. Though without a standing army or a fleet, its members, dispersed across Europe, mobilized their resources and expertise. They established field hospitals, ambulance services, and relief centers on various fronts, often operating under the flags of their respective nations, but united by the Maltese cross. In Rome, the Grand Magistry coordinated efforts to provide medical aid and comfort to wounded soldiers, prisoners of war, and civilians caught in the crossfire. This period saw the order solidify its identity as a truly international humanitarian organization, transcending national allegiances in its mission of mercy. It was a practical demonstration of its evolving sovereignty, one not based on land, but on universally recognized principles of aid. The interwar years, though marked by fragile peace, allowed the order to consolidate its structure and expand its charitable networks. It established national associations in various countries, each dedicated to supporting the order's global mission while addressing local needs. This decentralized yet unified approach allowed for greater flexibility and reach. Hospitals, dispensaries, and social welfare programs were initiated or expanded, offering medical care, food, and shelter to those suffering from poverty, disease, or the lingering scars of war. It was during this time that the order began to lay the groundwork for its modern legal status, seeking formal recognition from international bodies and states as a sovereign entity, despite its lack of territory. This was a unique proposition in international law, a concept that had no direct precedent. The Second World War, a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality, again called the order to action. As bombs fell and nations clashed, the order's neutrality, rooted in its humanitarian mission, allowed it to operate across enemy lines, providing aid to all victims, regardless of nationality or creed. This was a perilous undertaking, often requiring delicate negotiations and immense courage. They ran hospitals, organized relief convoys, and facilitated the exchange of prisoners of war. One lesser-known detail from this period is the order's role in providing safe passage and assistance to refugees, including many Jewish individuals fleeing persecution in Nazi-occupied territories. Their diplomatic passports, though issued by an entity without land, were sometimes honored, offering a fragile shield against the horrors of the Gestapo. This quiet heroism, often unsung, speaks volumes about the order's enduring commitment to its founding principles. After the war, the world grappled with the immense task of reconstruction and reconciliation. The Order of Malta, having proven its invaluable role in humanitarian crises, found itself in a stronger position to assert its unique status. In 1951, the Order's sovereignty was explicitly recognized by the Holy See in a comprehensive legal document, clarifying its relationship with the Church while affirming its independent international personality. This recognition was crucial, paving the way for broader diplomatic relations. By the mid-20th century, the Order had established diplomatic relations with a growing number of states, a testament to its recognized sovereignty and its effective humanitarian work. This was a significant achievement, as historians still debate the precise legal nuances of a non-territorial sovereign entity. Is it a state in the traditional sense, or something entirely new, a unique legal personage born of history and humanitarian purpose? The discussion continues, highlighting the Order's singular place on the global stage. The latter half of the 20th century saw the Order expand its global reach exponentially. It became an observer at the United Nations in 1994, further solidifying its international standing. Its activities diversified to address the evolving needs of a complex world. Beyond traditional medical care, the Order engaged in disaster relief, providing immediate aid in the wake of earthquakes, tsunamis, and famines across continents. It established programs for the elderly, the disabled, and the marginalized, offering not just material assistance, but also companionship and dignity. The Order's volunteers, drawn from diverse backgrounds and professions, became its hands and feet, working tirelessly in some of the most challenging environments. From refugee camps in Africa to hospices in Europe, the Maltese Cross became a familiar symbol of hope and healing. This era also saw the Order actively engage in diplomatic efforts, using its unique neutral status to promote peace and dialogue. Its diplomatic missions, though small, often served as quiet conduits for communication between nations, particularly during times of tension. The Order's focus shifted from the grand geopolitical schemes of its past to the quiet, persistent work of alleviating suffering and fostering human connection. It was a transformation from a martial order to a truly compassionate one, embodying the spirit of its original mission in a modern context. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this evolution is how an institution, born of the Crusades and tempered by centuries of conflict, managed to adapt and thrive in a world that had seemingly left such ancient orders behind. Its resilience speaks to the enduring power of its core values. Today, the Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta, as it is formally known, continues its mission with unwavering dedication. It maintains diplomatic relations with over 100 states and has permanent observer status at numerous international organizations. Its vast network of medical, social, and humanitarian activities spans the globe, operating hospitals, clinics, ambulance corps, and social welfare programs in over 120 countries. The Order is a major provider of humanitarian aid, particularly in conflict zones and areas affected by natural disasters. Its commitment to serving the sick and the poor, the very foundation upon which it was built almost 1,000 years ago, remains its guiding star. The knights of old, clad in armor, defended pilgrims with swords. Their modern counterparts, clad in scrubs or humble civilian clothes, defend human dignity with compassion and care. The echoes of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta resonate not in the clash of steel, but in the quiet solace offered to those in need, a testament to an extraordinary journey through time. The world continued its relentless spin, and the Order, now formally known as the Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta, adapted with it. The 20th century, a period of unprecedented global conflict and social upheaval, tested its resilience in new ways. The two world wars, in particular, presented immense challenges, but also reaffirmed the Order's fundamental commitment to humanitarian aid. During the First World War, the Order's hospitals and medical personnel were active on multiple fronts, treating wounded soldiers regardless of their nationality or allegiance. They operated ambulance units, established field hospitals, and provided essential medical supplies, often in dangerous conditions. This neutrality, born from their ancient hospitaller vows, allowed them to transcend political divides, much as they had during the Crusades when they offered succor to pilgrims and crusaders alike, even in the midst of fierce religious conflict. After the devastation of the First World War, the Order turned its attention to the widespread suffering that lingered, including the Spanish flu pandemic, which swept across the globe. They established dispensaries and clinics, particularly in areas where medical infrastructure had been destroyed or was insufficient. The interwar period also saw the Order solidify its international legal status. In 1936, the Italian state formally recognized the Order's sovereignty, a crucial step that affirmed its unique position in international law, akin to a non-territorial state. This recognition allowed the Order to maintain diplomatic relations with various nations, facilitating its humanitarian work across borders. The Second World War brought even greater challenges. Rome, where the Order had its headquarters, became a focal point of conflict. Despite the dangers, the Order continued its medical and charitable activities. Its hospitals in Italy remained open, providing care to both military and civilian casualties. They also organized relief efforts for prisoners of war and refugees, often operating under the protection of their recognized neutrality. This period saw the Order's medical services expand significantly, utilizing its diplomatic network to coordinate aid efforts in various war-torn regions. Ambulances bearing the white 8-pointed cross moved through ravaged landscapes, a quiet testament to enduring compassion amidst chaos. In the post-war era, the Order, now fully divested of any territorial ambitions, focused exclusively on its original mission of hospitaller and charitable work. Its presence expanded globally, moving beyond its traditional European strongholds. New national associations were established in countries across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. This expansion reflected a conscious effort to address modern humanitarian crises, from natural disasters to endemic poverty and disease. The order's structure, while rooted in its medieval origins with its three classes of members, professed knights, members in obedience, and lay members, proved flexible enough to accommodate this global outreach. One of the most significant developments in the latter half of the 20th century was the order's increasing involvement in international development and emergency relief. They established medical centers in developing countries, often focusing on areas with limited access to healthcare. For instance, in the 1960s, the order began significant work in leprosy care, a disease that, while largely eradicated in the West, remained a scourge in many parts of the world. They founded and supported specialized hospitals and clinics, providing not only medical treatment, but also rehabilitation and social support for those afflicted. This initiative echoed their historical role in caring for the sick and marginalized, much as they had done for pilgrims suffering from various ailments in the Holy Land centuries earlier. The order's diplomatic network also grew considerably. By the early 21st century, it maintained diplomatic relations with over 100 states, as well as permanent observer status at the United Nations and other international organizations. This unique diplomatic standing allowed the order to operate effectively in complex geopolitical environments, facilitating the delivery of aid and advocating for humanitarian principles. Historians still debate the precise legal implications of this non-territorial sovereignty, whether it is a true state in the traditional sense or a unique international entity. But its practical utility in enabling the order's global mission is undeniable. This status allows them to sign treaties, issue passports to their officials, and maintain a presence at international forums, all in service of their humanitarian goals. In recent decades, the order has continued to adapt its humanitarian efforts to address contemporary challenges. This includes responses to major natural disasters, such as the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and the 2010 Haiti earthquake, where their medical teams and volunteers were among the first responders. They also provide ongoing support to refugees and displaced persons, operating medical clinics and aid programs in conflict zones and refugee camps. For example, in the Syrian refugee crisis, the order established mobile clinics and distributed essential supplies to those fleeing the conflict, drawing upon centuries of experience in caring for vulnerable populations. The order's activities today are incredibly diverse. They run hospitals, hospices, and nursing homes, organize first aid training, provide social assistance to the elderly, disabled, and homeless, and support initiatives for palliative care. They are particularly active in providing medical assistance to marginalized communities and victims of modern scourges, such as human trafficking. The eight-pointed cross, once a symbol of military protection and pilgrimage, now primarily represents medical care and charitable service, seen on ambulances, hospital buildings, and the uniforms of volunteers across the globe. The enduring legacy of the Knights Hospitaller, from their medieval origins to their modern-day humanitarian endeavors, is a testament to remarkable resilience and adaptation over 9 centuries. From the dusty streets of Jerusalem, where they first cared for weary pilgrims, to the modern operating theaters and refugee camps of today, their core mission has remained steadfast: to serve the sick and the poor. The transformation from a military religious order defending Christian territories to a purely humanitarian organization with global reach is a complex and fascinating journey. It speaks to the power of an idea, that of Christian charity and service, to transcend political upheaval, territorial loss, and societal change. The Order's ability to survive the fall of Jerusalem, the loss of Rhodes, the siege of Malta, the Napoleonic disruptions, and 2 world wars, while continuously reinventing its mode of operation, is a unique phenomenon in history. It is a living bridge between the medieval world and the present, carrying forward traditions of service and compassion. The ancient vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, once taken by warrior monks, are now embodied by professionals and volunteers dedicated to alleviating suffering in a world vastly different from the one in which the Order was founded. Their story is not one of static preservation, but of dynamic evolution, demonstrating that even the most ancient institutions can find new purpose and relevance in a constantly changing world. The whispers of ancient walls, perhaps, still carry the echoes of their initial mission, now amplified across continents and centuries.